Hi, everyone. I want to go ahead and welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Brett Josephson. I'm the Associate Dean for Executive Development and Associate Professor of Marketing in the School of Business at George Mason. Really excited to be joined by my colleague, Nada. I'm going to give her a chance to introduce herself and her former doc student and fellow assistant professor in a moment. But really excited for this webinar because it's something that Nada and I have talked about for a couple months. And when we're looking at this idea of moving into an online environment, many organizations, many companies, many instructors and teachers were thrust into something that they weren't familiar with. And Neda is an absolute expert in this, written several books on the topic, and is a part of our Chief Learning Officer program. And it was really a passion for me in executive development to say, how do we go in and provide some additional training and some additional offerings to help organizations and instructors do this. So with that, I just want to welcome you all to this program today. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to turn over to Neda, and from here on, it is you. So thank you so much for doing this and for everyone for joining.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks for this introduction. It's a really great opportunity that you have provided for me and Ghania to conduct these series of webinars, and we're really excited about this. So I am Nada Dabbagh, and I've been at George Mason for 21 years. I am a professor of learning technologies, and I'm also the director of the Division of Learning Technologies in the College of Education and Human Development at George Mason University. And my area of expertise is online learning and instructional design and personalized learning. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ghania Zgheibfor. I'm an assistant professor of instructional design and technology at the University of Parliament in Lebanon. I'm also the MA coordinator for the instructional design program, and I am a George Mason University alum. So I'm happy to be here with you as well today.
And just in case you're wondering, I'm originally from Lebanon, so both Ghania and I come from the same country, and so it's exciting to work with Ghania as a colleague, and she's a graduate of George Mason as well from our program. So I want to first say welcome, and it's really cool to see we received the spreadsheet of everyone who's joining us today. I want to give a shout out to Jen Page. She's one of our alums from a while back when we had the immersion program in instructional design at George Mason. I also want to give a shout out to Abed Almala, who's also an alum of our Ph.D. program at George Mason. So there's a lot of alums. I hope you're all there. And we also have quite a few faculty and staff from George Mason and from other universities. We also have somebody from the Copenhagen Business School. So welcome, Copenhagen. We also have a few folks from Fairfax County Health Department, and we also have some folks from C-Squared Technologies. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope that this will be a very informative and practical series of webinars. We're open to chatting with you at the end of the webinar, open for your questions. We're going to do some polling in this first webinar to make it a little bit interactive, and we will be increasing that for the webinar number 2 and webinar number 3. So it's great. Thank you for joining us. I also wanted to mention that we have a few folks from the Department of Defense as well, and we have some folks from our C-suite, the Chief Learning Officer and Chief Risk Officer and Chief Data Officer program that is supported and sponsored by the Executive Education program that Brett is leading. So I want to, so what we hope to accomplish in the next hour, so sit back, relax, enjoy the webinars, and these will be recorded, and so you will receive a recording at the end. Once the recording has been uploaded, Brett will do that and then send you that, so you could go back to certain places in the webinar if you wanted to take notes or review some things. So what we wanted to do first is start with some basic definitions, if you will, of online learning and how we see online learning, and based on the research, based on the pedagogy. And we wanted to give you an overview of online learning, and then we want to present sort of a framework, if you will, or an approach that is based on theory and pedagogy. It's the 5 principles of meaningful online learning, which we want to be your takeaways for today. And of course, we are going to show you some very concrete examples of use on how you could actually implement these 5 principles when you design online learning interactions or learning experiences, and also when you are teaching as an online class. So this is basically our objectives for today's webinar. And then the next webinar that we're doing next Thursday, a week from today, is going to focus more specifically on learning technologies, because as you know, technology is an integral part of any online learning design or development initiative. So in the next webinar, we will be showing sort of a taxonomy, if you will, or a classification of learning technologies, and talk about their affordances, and also talk about how you can leverage those technologies for instruction and for instructional strategies and instructional design. And then the third webinar that we're doing in 2 weeks from today, that would be Thursday, August 13th, I believe. And in that one, we're going to focus on online learning assessment. So we have specific foci for each of these webinars. And today we will start with sort of an overview and give you a framework or an approach that you can use to keep in mind when you're designing online learning experiences. So I want to first, say that we've all had to sort of shift to this, what they're calling, or we're all calling, emergency remote teaching and learning. So we want to make a distinction between the current, the emergency remote teaching and learning that we've all sort of had to pivot towards or jump into back in March with no prior notice. We all had to, at least in higher education and K-12 schools, and I also think in many of your organizations, whether you're working for government or corporate or local government, organizations, we've all had to pivot very quickly into this online teaching and learning mode. Without any preparation. So it was kind of a rush in all schools, higher education institutions, training organizations, to move all our teaching and learning programs online. So this was sort of an unprecedented disruption to our education system. And we were not prepared. I mean, even people like me who are experts on online learning, I'm also having to take time to redesign my courses and make sure that I'm doing them based on pedagogy and based on instructional design principles. And I really have not had the time to do that. So we've had to pivot without any prior notice from face-to-face or instructor-led training to totally 100% online teaching. And we want to emphasize that there is a significant difference between remote teaching and learning and online teaching and learning. So it's not just a matter of recording your lectures or PowerPoint presentations and putting them online. It's not just a matter of having, Zoom sessions like the one we're doing and, being able to disseminate the content in synchronous learning interactions. There's a lot more that we need to do in order to ensure that online learning is effective and online learning is successful, and that we don't focus, we don't lose students because of attrition. And so I wanted to make sure that we understand that this pivot was not really expected, and it has really kind of thrown us into a tizzy, if you will, without having the time to focus on the actual pedagogy of the design of online learning. So we want to do a short poll here. I think, Ghania, if you would do that, ask you if you also had to jump or pivot into this online mode. Wow. So it looks like
I will
80.
end the poll and share the results.
Okay.
So more people are answering.
Okay. I can see that on my other screen.
Okay. So now that it shows that 84% of the attendees had to pivot to 100% online teaching and training.
Okay. Well, that's a quite a large number.
Yeah, you can see the results, right?
Yes, I can see them. I hope our audience can. I can see them on my other screen. So, yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Good. So I'll stop sharing.
Okay. So, okay, I think you need to, okay, stop sharing the results. Okay. So, I can still see the results, Ghania. Maybe you need to remove them, or because they're blocking the screen.
Are they still? Because I closed the polling. Brett, can you still see the results too?
Okay, I think they're out.
I cannot see it, yeah.
Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Ghania so she can just give us a basic, understanding of what is online learning, real online learning, and not the part. And then she's going to walk us through some basic moderating variables that impact the design of online learning experiences.
Thanks, Nada. Thank you. So what is online learning specifically? Many people have the experience with online learning, have taught online or designed online trainings before, but other people, as we have noticed in the poll, they had to jump in and design online learning, online courses, and teach online. So online learning in its simplest form is any learning that takes place virtually online using the internet. However, we would like to use a more pedagogically driven definition for online learning in order for it to be meaningful and engaging. It's open and distributed learning environment that uses pedagogical and technological tools to facilitate learning and knowledge building through meaningful action and interaction. This is what we would like to focus on in our webinars, meaningful online learning rather than remote online teaching. Next slide, Nata, please. I also want to emphasize what online learning is not. Nada, do you mind? Yes, thank you. Online learning is not, as some instructors might make the mistake of thinking that you can easily create and upload lecture notes, create online tests, and perhaps include some PowerPoint files and web links. While it's true that a course can be easily developed that way, it will not result in an effective course that promotes meaningful and engaging learning. And courses that do not take into consideration pedagogical approaches lead to higher dropout rates, student disengagement, passive learning, which you might have been experiencing with your students while teaching online. Bad design of online learning may lead to misconceptions, and that's why I have the visual there on the side. I don't think there are bad cooks, just bad recipes, because if online learning is not well designed pedagogically using methodological and theoretical approaches, it could lead really to bad cooking. So that if the recipe is bad, you won't have effective online learning. So it's important to consider these pedagogical approaches, but it's also important to consider the different communication or interaction formats or modes of online learning. And by this we mean, Nada, the next slide, please. By this we mean asynchronous and synchronous online learning, which are also known as communication synchrony in online learning. So to begin with, what is asynchronous online learning and teaching? It is when the student and the teacher or the instructor do not meet online at the same time. It means that the learner completes tasks when he or she chooses at their own pace and time, or following a deadline, but activities are usually monitored by an instructor if the asynchronous activities are instructor-led. As we know in training, in corporate training, many of the trainings are self-paced. But in schools and universities, they're more instructor-led. So these asynchronous activities have to be monitored by the instructor. Usually there are due dates for the tasks to be completed, and the students are held accountable for this. Now, asynchronous methods and strategies include audio-video recorded lectures that are not passively passed on to the student, but that are interactive, that include some tasks that the students have to complete as a result of these lectures. Discussion forums, interactive video lessons, collaborative wikis, social media activities, games, and simulations. Several technologies can be used to support these methods, including wikis. We'll be talking about these in this webinar and the next webinar. YouTube videos, PowerPoint, interactive PowerPoint, Powtoon, GoAnimate, Edpuzzle, blogs, learning management systems such as Moodle, Edmodo, or other learning management systems that are being used in the training field. Now, synchronous online learning and teaching, on the other hand, requires that all learners are online at a scheduled time, like we are doing in this webinar, live video conferencing. The methods and the strategies may include instant messaging, live chats, video conferencing, broadcasting. Some technologies that we're familiar with, WebEx, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Skype, are among these technologies. Of course, there's many, many more that could facilitate asynchronous online learning. Now, while there are some advantages to this form of online learning, such as engaging learners in live discussions, there are some disadvantages for synchronous online learning. For instance, internet connectivity is an issue in many parts of the world. Another challenge is keeping the learners engaged in video conferencing sessions. So there should be a balance between synchronous and asynchronous online learning when designing online learning. Synchronous learning is more impactful in the immediate sense, high social presence, cognitive presence, it's engaging, it's community-centered, while asynchronous learning offers more flexibility, more time on task, more time to think and reflect on one's learning, and it's more self-directed and self-paced. So now we would like to hear from you and know whether you've been using synchronous or asynchronous online learning. So we're going to ask you to respond to this poll again. Well, good to see that the majority are using both, which is ideal. So I'll give a few more seconds for more people to respond. Okay, I will end the poll and share results. So the majority are using both synchronous and asynchronous, which is ideal in an online learning environment, blending both worlds. This is really good. I'm gonna stop sharing the results and pass it over to Nada now to talk to us about the 5 principles for meaningful online learning and examples of use.
Thanks, Ghania. So I hope you guys it sounds like you're very familiar with the affordances, learning affordances, and pedagogical affordances of synchronous versus asynchronous communication formats, as well as the technologies associated with these two modalities, if you will. And it does take some very careful design to differentiate between the two and to use them in a complementary fashion, as Ghania indicated. So what I'm going to do next is present this approach, if you will, this pedagogical approach that we want you to think about and use it as a framework when you're designing online learning interactions or experiences. And at the same time, we're going to give you examples of use for each one of those principles. I do want to mention, however, before I get started on that there are many moderating variables, as you know, that impact online teaching or online learning design. And we've mentioned the synchrony communication modes as a big moderating variable. But I also want to mention that there are many other moderating variables such as the motivation of your students, motivational factors that you need to be tuned into. Also, your pedagogical approach or style of teaching or the way you're doing instructional design also is a big moderating variable on the online learning environment that you design. Also, the learner's attitudes and beliefs about themselves and their self-efficacy are also is also an important moderating variable. Also, the individual goals of learning versus the curricular goals of the program or your training program and the objectives. Class size is another moderating variable. And then there's also many environmental factors that act as a big moderating variable that you should keep in mind as you're designing or teaching online. So with environmental factors, as you've seen, technology is a huge environmental factor because it shapes the digital learning space. So I'm a believer that technology is not just a tool. In fact, technology has affordances, as we have shown you with respect to synchrony, that really shape the digital learning space and shape the instructional experience and the learning experience. And we're going to dig a little bit more into that in our next webinar. So technology is integral to designing online learning experiences. And so it's really important to leverage the affordances of technology to create meaningful and engaging learning opportunities in order to, improve retention, stop attrition of your students, keep them focused, keep them engaged. So it's really important to be informed about all these moderating variables. So I'm going to jump into the framework. It's a simple framework, and we call it the Meaningful Online Learning Framework, and it's got 5 principles: active, constructive, cooperative, authentic, and intentional. So as you design online learning experiences, you want to keep those 5 principles in mind. You want to make sure that your designs include at least 1 or 2 or more of these principles, and they are interdependent, meaning, if you design a learning activity that supports the active principle, then you're probably also supporting the constructive principle in some way and the cooperative principle in some other way. So we're gonna kind of dig into that. So research has shown, of course, also we're coming from a research perspective, we're in higher education. So it's shown that these characteristics lead to meaningful and engaging learning, learning that is relevant, learning that is transferable, learning that is usable, learning that has value, purpose, and significance. Hence, if you design with this framework in mind or this approach in mind, you will, as I said, reduce attrition, you will encourage persistence among your audience, you will ensure high quality instructional experiences, and you will guarantee effective learning and success. So I'm going to start with the first principle, active. And so what we mean by the first principle is, it's also characterized in this figure, if you can see the writing underneath the word active, as the learner being manipulative and observant. In other words, you want to engage the learner in doing things and in thinking or reflecting about the things they are doing. Another way of looking at this is perhaps experiential learning. I'm sure you've heard of the pedagogical approach, experiential learning. There's also an approach called learning by doing, and it's when you engage your learners in real world tasks, such as getting them, putting them in the role of an informal scientist or mathematician or manager or leader at your organization. So allowing them to engage with the environment and to manipulate the environment in a positive way. And then you want them to observe their actions and the consequences of their actions. So meaningful learning really begins when we actively engage with our environment and observe the effects of our actions. So let's now look at an example of, I'm going to turn it over to Ghania to show us what is an example of a learning activity that you might design that includes this active learning principle.
Thanks, Nada. So as Nada said, active learning is learning by doing, whether we do it in face-to-face or online. And a lot of the activities that are done in a face-to-face classroom can be transitioned to an online environment if it's used effectively. So I'm going to give you an example on how to design a learning activity that supports the active principle of the MOL framework. A very simple example that you can implement in a synchronous session, in a live video conferencing session, is, for example, engaging learners in collaboratively creating a mind map, like you see on the slide on the top right. A mind map is a concept map, which essentially is a visual representation of content. I'm going to quickly show you an example on this tool, Coggle. Okay. So I'm just, Nada, do you mind stop sharing so that I share?
Yeah.
It's not allowing me for some reason. Okay, so I'm going to share real quick a tool that I like to use a lot in my courses. It's Coggle. It allows individual mind map creation and collaborative mind map. So if you see here on the top right, you see multiple users of this mind map. So students can collaborate on it to create this mind map. What's really cool about it is that it helps students reflect on content that they are reading about and classifying it into different categories, groups, or brainstorming. Let's say you're working on a topic where you want your students to brainstorm ideas. Also, it's a very good tool to help students reflect on the learning and brainstorm ideas. So I use mind mapping all the time with my students, whether I'm doing it in a synchronous online setting, I'm doing a live synchronous session where I can share with them ahead of time the collaborative mind map. They can collaborate right on the spot, or asynchronously as a task that they can do on their own time. I'm going to stop sharing, Nada. If you can please reshare the PowerPoint.
Okay.
And there are many other technologies that support mind mapping out there. You can even use a simple Word document, smart art, to help students brainstorm and think about the content. In the next webinar, we will talk about many more technologies, so stay tuned. An example of how to implement the principle of active learning using asynchronous communication would be, for example, asking students to post their presentations and projects on a tool called VoiceThread, where they can provide each other feedback, written, audio, and video feedback about a certain assignment, about certain content that they have created. Let's say you ask them to create a video for an assignment, they can post it on VoiceThread and give each other feedback, collaborate, and comment on each other. Now, we would like you to share with us if you've ever used any activity that supports active learning, active principle in your online learning. We would like you please to share it with us in the chat box. We will comment on some of them and then aggregate the remaining ones to share in the next webinar. So feel free please to share them in the chat.
And yeah, I'm curious, you know, one of the things I've tried to do in my MBA class is combine a synchronous activity, do with some of these active learning modules, and then have it being reinforced with some sort of asynchronous thing that they're doing as well. Is that something that you've seen? I find it's tricky to do both, but to have an active learning activity, an integration, some process that feeds into both synchronous sessions as well as an asynchronous thing that they're doing on the back end.
Yeah,
it's a great question, Brett. And actually, it's like you're talking
strategy.
about blending, right? You're blending the synchronous and asynchronous activities. So, yeah, how have you done that? Like, Ghania, do you have some examples? One example that comes to mind with me is when you break out your students or learning, you know, target audience into breakout rooms, whether you're using Zoom or you're using, you know, Blackboard Collaborate, or you're using, you know, whatever LMS you're using, or WebEx. You can actually have them do synchronous meetings if you have them doing project-based learning, breaking into teams in the breakout rooms, right? And then they could be doing some asynchronous prep before they get to that.
Yeah, I think many of the activities can be, let's say, started in a synchronous environment, and then students can complete them collaboratively later asynchronously using technologies that you would use with them synchronously, such as Zoom or WebEx. We want to encourage learners to use the technologies that you use as an instructor for collaboration and communication. Many of the activities you do can be easily blended.
And what I like about
comments here. Yes, Nada, you can go ahead.
Yeah, what I like about Brett's question is, you know, so as you said, Ghania, you can start synchronous and then follow it up with asynchronous, or you can start asynchronous and then follow it up with synchronous. So essentially, you're doing what we call a crossover protocol, which is also sort of a research that we do when we do face-to-face and online. So you could do something when you're doing hybrid teaching and learning. You could start something in a face-to-face class, which is you know, akin to synchronous, and then you can have the students follow up with asynchronous. So that is actually,
and we have some good responses in the chat from I don't know if I'm Miss Chamberlain or Mr. Chamberlain, I'm not sure. Students solve problems in a synchronous online class, sometimes in breakout rooms, which is some of the examples we were talking about. Ask students to write on the stream, ask questions and give feedback. Using Mentimeter to engage students actively. Good responses.
Great.
From Lynn, Lynn is saying that she sent out something to read and then asked them to supply responses as they met via Zoom, and Lynn will try to use Zoom breakout. This is great. Okay, many good examples using Zoom, breaking students into different rooms. I think it's a very effective strategy, breaking students into groups and then rejoining as a whole class to share, just as we do in a normal classroom, in a physical classroom.
But I want to emphasize also, yeah, these are all great examples, but I want to emphasize that you need to keep that active principle in mind. So that is really the core of this principle. And we're showing you how you could implement the active principle using synchronous and asynchronous communication modes. And so it's great when you can think about, what do I do synchronously? What do I do asynchronously? But always keep in mind, what is the learning activity that's going to engage the students in active learning? So I think you want to start with the principle, and then you want to sort of try to see how you can implement this principle using the two synchrony modalities.
Yep.
So the next principle in this meaningful online learning framework is constructive. And as you could see also underneath the word constructive, it means the learner is articulative and reflective. So this is a little bit different than the learning by doing approach, the manipulative, the observant, and the active principle. And what this one really means is when you allow your learners to articulate their understanding of the topic. So you want them to, if they're reading the content or they have their readings, you want them to be able to articulate their understanding of their readings. So this is called, you know, constructive learning. And the way you could do that is you could have them do a blog, and I'll get into that in a minute, or you can have them do a discussion. These types of learning activities really support this constructive principle of meaningful online learning. And so and then you also want them to reflect on their understanding. So what's cool about an online discussion is that, you know, they're articulating their understanding of the topic based on some questions that you may have posted or they may have brought to bear. And then at the end of the discussion, they can reflect back on the discussion or reflect back on the experience and also have some takeaways from that. So basically, their mental models are becoming increasingly complex as you allow them to engage in this, you know, constructive principle, because they may start with simple understanding of the concepts that you're trying to convey in your class, whether you're teaching a business class, a leadership class, you know, what are the main constructs that you want them to be able to understand? And they start with constructing their own simple mental models. And then as they go forward in articulating and reflecting, their mental models become more complex, you know, as they learn how to articulate and reflect. So I also want to say here that the active and the constructive principles are related, and they're complementary, and they sort of work hand in hand. So if you engage students in active learning, they're also going to be constructing their understanding of this new knowledge that you want them to understand. However, the way we implement these principles in online learning environments might be a little bit different. So here I'm providing a different example for implementing the constructive principle using the two modalities or the two communication formats of synchronous and asynchronous. I'm very fond of a platform called Mural. I'll try to share it in a minute. I'm not a, I don't have any business dealings with them. It is a costly platform, but I write about it in my book. It's a very cool platform that really engages, learners in constructive learning. So it allows collaborative brainstorming or collaborative generation of ideas. So it's a little bit different than the mind mapping exercise of Kaggle that Ghania mentioned. It is a sort of a much more interactive and team-based approach. It allows, I don't know if you're familiar with design thinking and design thinking phenomenon and the design thinking approach to designing whatever product you want your learners to be able to design, user experience design. But Mural is a really cool platform that allows you to engage your students in collaborative brainstorming and collaborative generation of ideas. And then for the asynchronous modality or format, if you will, as I mentioned, online discussions, even though they're kind of heavy, they're text-based, at least the ones we have in our learning management systems. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. They're more threaded types of discussions where, you have a prompting post and then someone replies and another person replies to that person. So you generate threads, and you could generate multiple threads in this, asynchronous learning management system things, but they've become a little bit more sophisticated. You can use VoiceThread also for doing asynchronous discussions. But as students are, discussing the content, discussing the article that you gave them to read, discussing the essay, discussing a chapter in the book, the cool thing again about these technologies is that they're archivable. Students can go back and reflect on their postings and sort of, generate a self-assessment or a reflective assessment, what were their own takeaways. So they're very effective. And they also allow the students to articulate their understanding. So these are two examples of how do you engage your learners with constructive learning. Actually, I'm not gonna share the screen because we're sort of, want to keep going, but you can Google Mural, and I think the website is mural.com. It's www.mural.co, and it's an HTTPS website. And so take a look at that. It is, they may have a free version, and there may be other, I think one of you mentioned in the chat that you're using an active whiteboard. There may be other technologies as well that allow you to use a whiteboard. So this is kind of similar to
like Miro.
Oh, okay.
I want to mention, sorry, Nada, one thing. Kaggle is a free tool for up to like 3 mind maps that you can recycle, like reuse.
Okay.
While Mural is not for free.
Okay. So the way I do online discussions in my courses, I make sure that they're structured. Like I make sure that there's a timeline. So we're going to start the online discussion on a Monday. We're going to end it on a Sunday. And we're going to show you in the third webinar, when we do the online assessment webinar, we're going to show you how to evaluate using a rubric, the discussion postings, and, how many, what does the research say about how many postings one should post and how many replies, and how you can make it. You can also ask the students, as you could see from this screen, to rate the postings, even though I don't really recommend that because that might create some, controversy among the students themselves. But there are other also, little nuances that you could do for engaging your students in constructive learning. So, let's see. If you've used an online activity that supports the constructive principle, please share it in the chat. And I'm gonna keep going, I think, to the cooperative principle. So the cooperative principle, I'm sure this would be probably, you're more familiar with this principle. It's, engaging your learners in collaborative and conversational activities. And so it's really social learning, if you will. So with online learning, now that we don't have to do social distancing or physical distancing, well, let's get social. And so really, you want to try to get your students or your audience to be as cooperative as possible and engage them in learning activities that are cooperative. And so this could be working together in communities of practice. They could be taking advantage of each other's skills and knowledge to support their goals and action. You could be engaging them in project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, where they have to go into breakout rooms and do things together, communicate with each other, listen to each other's perspectives, work together to accomplish the task at hand. So this also enables the co-construction of knowledge. So they're constructing their understanding of the topic and the principles collaboratively. And that's why we refer to it as the co-construction of knowledge. So this attribute is actually also very, as you could see, related to the constructive principle, because they are co-constructing knowledge. So the constructive principle was more individualistic in the sense that you want to engage them as individuals to construct their understanding and articulate their understanding, whereas the cooperative principle allows you to do that in a more collaborative and conversational manner with co-construction. So and now I'm going to turn it over to Ghania to give us some examples of how this cooperative principle can be implemented in online learning. And if you want to share some of the chat things, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to share Rima, my colleague, Rima's comments about constructive learning. I think Rima's commenting on constructive, saying that they use scientific paper critiques to provide criticism or something they liked about the paper. I'm wondering, Rima, if this is done in the classroom or with colleagues, fellow researchers that you work with, but really giving students the time to reflect and do peer evaluation is very important as well. I'm a classroom with students. This is excellent, Rima. I want to share an example about cooperative. Nada pretty much gave a very good overview of what cooperative learning. And I really want to emphasize the importance of creating this collaborative and cooperative environment in online learning so that students don't feel isolated. You know, in the classroom, they can see each other, they can interact, they can talk to each other, they feel the presence of fellow students and the teacher. We need to transition this to online learning so that students feel that there is some form of presence there is social interaction, especially that online learning is built on social learning theories. So an example of a synchronous activity that promotes cooperation is something we've just talked about a few minutes ago, which is breaking students into breakout rooms on WebEx and Zoom. I don't want to repeat myself. There are other ways, of course, to do it. Microsoft Teams doesn't have a breakout room, but you can create multiple channels. But if you're doing like a synchronous live session, you can tell the students, okay, you have 15 minutes. I would like you to go into your groups. You can assign the groups as you see in the on the right of the slide. You can either assign students randomly to different groups, or you can select who should work with who. And tell them you have 15 minutes to discuss, and then we're going to come back as a whole class and discuss what you've come up with. So you can end the session anytime you want. And as an instructor, you can go into join the rooms in and out. This is what Brett was talking about. Join the rooms, go in and out, and talk to students, give feedback, interact with them. Also to create this sense of teacher presence in the class. Another example of asynchronous cooperative learning, again, I'm re-emphasizing the importance of having an aspect of collaboration in online learning, is, for example, using collaborative online tools that could facilitate online collaboration, such as wikis. If you're familiar with them, we'll talk more about them in the next webinar. Wikis allow students to collaborate in groups. As an instructor or teacher, you can follow the history, check the history, and see who contributed to the task, who posted something and who did not among your students. So you're able to follow this. Other tools that can be used for asynchronous collaboration are Google Docs. So the Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Slides, they afford a lot of collaboration. Students can go work on the same document, add, edit, delete, etc. And Dropbox, which many of us use for our personal use, students can use it as well to collaborate. And as an instructor, you can monitor who has posted. Specifically, if you ask every student to have a document for himself so that you can track who is posting and who's not, because teachers find it a challenge when you give a collaborative group task to monitor if one student is doing all the work or not. In online, it's easier to monitor than when you're doing it in face-to-face.
And I also want to add, Ghania, for those of you in the corporate world, working in the Department of Defense and working in the learning and development and training context, obviously Microsoft Teams is a very popular and a very robust software system that allows project-based learning and for folks to be working in teams. So SharePoint, I think, is another tool that many of you in the corporate world use. We're starting to use Microsoft Teams right now in higher education for our own administrative, collaborations. We have not yet used it in a teaching context, but I think I might try that. And there's also Slack. I know a lot of organizations are using Slack as a back channel sort of communication tool, I believe asynchronous. So these are also some examples of the more, systems that are used in the corporate world.
Arlene is asking about Google Meet real quick. It has a new interface, so I'm not sure if they have breakout rooms, but one quick solution is to ask students to meet, like you break out the class and tell them, okay, this group you meet alone, you figure it out. You can give them some instructions and then they can come back to the main class.
Right, and I believe Google Hangout also allows you to do that, to have their own Hangout rooms. But again, the main core principle here is cooperative learning, which means, collaborative, conversational learning. So you want to make these activities that support collaboration, support project-based work, and support conversational, multiple perspectives, interactions among your audience. Great. So the last principle is we have two more to go. So I'm going to kind of, because we're sort of, we want to give you room for questions. We have two more principles to do. The authentic principle. So basically this means, engaging your audience with real world tasks. So it's a little bit similar to the active principle, but it's somewhat different. And so these are tasks that are grounded in the real world. So I know a lot of you in the business sphere, the law school at Harvard, and a lot of our business programs at Mason, we have something called case-based learning. So case-based learning is a really good example of engaging your students in authentic learning, because it really gives them cases on their discipline, what's happening in the real world. Problem-based learning is another pedagogical approach that really supports the authentic principle. You want to get your students to actually engage in problem solving, a real world problem, environmental problem, a business problem. So those are the types of activities. Scenario-based learning would be a huge also approach to support this principle. So again, you want to engage your students in real world problem solving and complex problem solving. So don't try to strip the content for them. Don't try to make the content easy for them and say, all you have to do is just look at that, or, read this paragraph and then come and do a test. No, you want them to be able to witness the complexity of the real world problems that they will engage in after they graduate, or if they're currently employees of an organization. So you don't want to strip the content for them. You don't want to make it easier. You want them to perceive the complexity. You want them to engage in hypothesis generation and be able to problem solve and formulate their own understanding. So this is that authentic principle. And the examples of authentic principle, I think, Ghania, you're going to cover that quickly.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, really quick. So authentic learning, Nada explained it really well, but how do we translate them into online activities? So for instance, asynchronous online learning, if you're teaching through video conferencing, one example could be to ask your students to turn their cameras off and share experiments that they're doing live at the same time. Another example could be debates, could be role-playing exercises that you do live on Zoom, on WebEx, as you're teaching. Another example are virtual worlds, where you can go into a virtual world together with your students and teach a class. Like, for example, Second Life is one of the virtual worlds. Another one is SimCity. That's also being used in education. You can schedule a certain time to be in there with your students and covering some learning objectives. And so the same principle of authenticity may be achieved asynchronously as well, thanks to video recording, which students use all the time. You can ask them to record a certain task that you want them to complete, whether it's psychomotor or another type of task where you want them to show the outcome or the work that they're doing. They can video record it and post it on tools such as, for example, we talked about VoiceThread. Another tool is Flipgrid. They can be recording, posting videos of something they've done live and commenting on each other.
Great.
So technology can really bridge the gap between this virtual and real life. Nada?
Great, thanks, Ghania. And the last principle of meaningful online learning is the intentional principle. And this is a really important one, particularly for adult learners that many of us are supporting, whether it's in higher education or in the corporate government sector. So as you know, adult learners are, self-directed learning is an andragogy for adult learners, but the idea is to empower your learners to be goal-directed, to be able to engage in self-regulated learning skills, and to have intentional behavior, intentional goals. So the idea is that all human behavior is goal-directed. And so everything we do is intended to fulfill some goal or purpose. Now, the goal may be simple, like satisfying hunger on Maslow's taxonomy, but it could be more complex in terms of developing new career skills, studying for a master's degree. So you want to be able, when you're designing online learning experiences, to make sure that they see this intentionality and they're able to buy into this intentionality and be goal-directed. And you want them to be actively and deliberately working towards a cognitive goal, a learning goal, a career goal, a skill that you want them to master. So they will be fulfilling sort of a personal intention. You want it to mean something to them. So in terms of, so you don't want them to be passive learners. I think we said that a lot. And sort of this intentional activity or principle kind of circles back into the active learning principle. So you're seeing now a full circle of those principles kind of coming together. And it's really important to keep in mind that all of these principles are interrelated. So quickly, two examples of intentional behavior of implementing the intentional principle of meaningful online learning is role play. Right? So if you're teaching leadership skills, or if you're teaching negotiation skills, or you could engage your students in a debate, and so give them roles to play. So give them an activity such as a live debate. So if you want them to practice coaching and mentoring skills, you could also give them that role to do. So role play activities are really a good example of supporting this intentionality principle, because they have a role to play, they have an intention, they have a purpose to accomplish. And so also, you could be doing this in real-time simulations and games or other immersive technologies that Ghania mentioned, if the bandwidth permits and if you have access to those. And an example of an asynchronous activity, online learning activity that engages students in the intentional principle is scenario-based e-learning activities, which I think many of you are doing in the corporate world. So you give them a scenario, or you're designing e-learning activities that are driven by scenarios. So many of my students have done that, particularly students in the corporate world. Like, if you're working in the Department of Defense and there's a scenario of something happening that they need to solve, this would be a great way of designing e-learning interaction that are all scenario driven, all like real world driven. They require analysis and reflection and problem solving. So these are some of the examples, and these are the 5 principles. We hope that you have some sort of a framework now or pedagogical approach to think about as you engage in designing meaningful and engaging online learning interactions and experiences. So this framework, by the way, of course, I'm going to make a plug to the book that I've written, co-authored with 2 of my colleagues in the University of Missouri, and that Ghania, my colleague, is using also at her university. And this book, this Meaningful Online Learning book, is really very applied. I mean, it starts with some of the principles and pedagogies that we just covered in this webinar, and then it goes into the applications and the technologies and the activities. So if you want to learn more about this, you can actually take a look at this book, and we will be covering in the next webinar a week from today. We will get more in depth into the learning technologies, the classification of the technologies, the affordances of the technologies, and in 2 weeks from now, we will get into the online assessment. So we have, I believe, I don't know, a few minutes for questions. Sorry, we should have left more, but please let us know if you have any questions, and we're happy to hang out a little bit more if you have any questions. And thank you for listening.
Thank you all.
So you could share in the chat, or if you want to unmute and share your video or ask a question, that would be fine.
Actually, in the webinar setting, they can't unmute themselves.
Oh.
Yeah. Rima, there are some examples, and some virtual labs have been made open now for the public. I can share with you some, if you can just send me an email. Due to the pandemic, some companies have provided free access to their virtual labs.
I believe, yeah, Mahalia was asking, a list of technologies with their applications. I think we're going to go through that a lot next week, and we can probably, obviously that will be made available for the public, and we can obviously, these will be posted on YouTube on the Mason the Mason Executive Development YouTube page, and so they can at least get that information, or even go to Nada's book.
Right. Absolutely. So next webinar will be definitely focused on the technologies, the classifications of the technologies, the lists, as Brett is referring to. There will be, a lot more examples of a list of technologies that you can use for the different activities that support the 5 principles of meaningful online learning.
Okay, there are some other questions. Sarah, sure, I can provide some examples if you can just send me an email. I'm not sure if you recorded my email. As for Dima is asking if WebEx or Microsoft Teams are better for teaching. WebEx is a video conferencing system. Microsoft Teams is more of a learning management system with a video conferencing system embedded in it. So they're Microsoft Teams combines both.
Well, actually, yeah, Microsoft Teams is more for sharing documents and collaborating on documents and doing a lot of teamwork. So, and it's very expensive. I don't know if you can really get a license for Microsoft Teams, even a free, I don't know. But mostly I think Zoom is being used and WebEx are being used more in the higher education sector and the teaching sector, I think.
Right, and Moodle and Blackboard more. Okay.
So we'll leave it to Brett to
Sarah had a great question of this idea of how do you substitute learning by doing in the sciences in a virtual environment. That just struck me as somebody who came up through the sciences, and even though I'm a business faculty, we all started basically as engineers. So, how do you do that in a virtual space? Even just to hear your guys' thoughts on that one, I think is going to be very, very interesting.
Yeah, so Ghania mentioned a little bit about how we would do that. Now, of course, it depends on the type of experiment, but there are a lot of teachers in K-12 context actually that are asking the students, of course, with the support of the parents, like they might go out in the environment and take pictures of certain things or watch things as they grow, or if they're testing water in their rivers or lakes around the areas that they live, and they're trying to figure out whether the water is contaminated or what's happening. Those are easier types of biological environmental experiments that students can do kind of on their own. And I believe there are mobile apps that allow the students to track the data and save it as to what they're testing, and then to share it with others. So we're getting better at this. We're getting better at being able to actually go out into the environment and allowing our students to conduct this research out in the open. But in terms of science experiments where you're really dealing with chemicals, that is a challenge. Now you can simulate that in immersive learning technologies, such as 3D immersive learning technologies. I don't know if you've all heard, we used to dissect a turtle online, which is very different than doing it an actual, but the simulations, some simulations are pretty sophisticated and allow you to do.
It's very advanced.
Yeah.
There are many open sources out there that you can take advantage of, really many. Assessment, we'll talk about this in the third webinar.
Yes.
Tamar. We'll be talking about this in detail.
Right. I think, we're a couple minutes past the hour, so I think we can go ahead and I want to thank the audience and the panelists. This has just been great. I know for me, it's got my head spinning and thinking about ways I can redesign and revise my MBA course. Because I think, you get the foundation, and it's really going to feed into that next webinar. I think a lot of instructors, instructional designers have ideas, but they don't know the technology. They don't know the implementation. So I'm really looking forward to next week when we can actually do that deep dive of here's the technologies that are out there, and here's what they afford you to do as a faculty member. I think that's going to be great. So thank you all for joining. We will be back next Thursday at 10 o'clock. We will send everybody who attended this webinar a link to those additional sessions as well. So thank you all again, and enjoy your day and be safe.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you, Brett. Goodbye. See you next week. Bye.